Spider-Man 2 is a simple movie, very easy to follow from beginning to end. While this analysis is extensive, spanning a couple of hours, much of what I will talk about is rather straightforward and hopefully will be easy to understand. Chances are I will say quite a few things you may have heard already about this movie, since Spider-Man 2 has stood the test of time and been explored over and over in greater or lesser detail. However, I can also guarantee there will be many things I talk about here that you would never have thought about or considered because they're outside the box of common thought or current narrative. If there's one aspect about the story that's more interesting than anything else, it would be the fact that this movie is more about Peter Parker than it is about Spider-Man. In fact, when I was younger, I believed that to be a detriment to the movie. As an adult, I can say for sure that it is actually the movie's greatest strength. Unlike Spider-Man, the first movie of the Raimi trilogy, Spider-Man 2 is far more personal, and more time is devoted to Peter out of costume than in. While the first movie was a journey forward into a new identity, Spider-Man 2 is about a retreat from that identity. In that regard, the film can also be viewed as a deconstruction of what Spider-Man is. I cannot remember the last time I saw Spider-Man 2, but this time around, watching it for the sake of this commentary, new windows of appreciation have opened up for me. Although credit for the movie's direction is owed to Sam Raimi, the story for Spider-Man 2 had 3 writers, primary of which was one Michael Chabon, whose name appears on the original script. And the original script is an interesting read itself, by the way, and from time to time I'll be talking about it in comparison to the finished movie. This commentary will be a mix of aspects that both work and don't work well in the story's favor, and I'll be addressing things chronologically according to how the movie is played out. Speaking of Sam Raimi, he is the ideal director for these comic book type movies. He has an over-the-top aesthetic. Action pieces are almost slapstick due in no small part to Raimi's being a huge fan of the Three Stooges.
And the hand's like right in the face and it's all wound up with wire. Get your hand out of my face, I tell you.
Get your hand out of my face. That ain't my hand, that's your hand. All right, you asked for it. Ow!
And he starts screaming because he realizes it's his own hand. I love those Stooges.
Much of the violence in Raimi's movies is undercut by silliness. Tense scenes involve tilted cameras, quick cuts, and blurred motion. The style attempts to mimic the panels of a comic book. Moreover, Raimi is sure to insert other hallmarks into his work outside his visual style. His brother, Ted Raimi, shows up regularly at the Daily Bugle as a glorified extra. And Bruce Campbell, star of Raimi's Evil Dead series, shows up as a theater usher. When I first saw Raimi's Spider-Man movies, I could count myself in on the joke, because I was also an avid watcher of Xena, Warrior Princess. A lot of these characters showed up as regulars on that TV show.
We'll be trying that again, huh?
They're okay. You worry, weren't you?
If there's a point I want to make here, it is that Raimi values style over substance and also likes getting his friends and family involved in his works. One should keep that in mind, by the way, if one tends to divulge his works for any logical consistency. Generally speaking, his works aren't made to attend to seriousness, but to melodrama. However, on the subject of internal logic, I shall also be making several observations of my own. Now, I should remind my viewers that my doing so is not to degrade the movie in any way. The movie works well regardless of these lapses in internal logic. As always, the point of my looking for consistency is for the sake of marking where improvements to the story could be made. For now, let's talk about the structure of the film. The story for Spider-Man 2 follows a classic 3-act structure, of which I shall break down. Now, if your movie has a 2-hour or 120-minute runtime, as Spider-Man 2 does, then surely each act ought to transpire over a period of 40 minutes or so. 40 minutes multiplied by 3 acts equals 120 minutes. Granted, in any given 3-act movie, this time frame is not always followed exactly, nor need it be. However, if one wants one's story to be far more concise and comfortable, these are ideally the frames in which they exist, and one may even test this theory in any given movie. If you watch a movie with a 3-act structure, look at the running time and divide it into 3. After that, try to figure out if the movie attends to introducing a new plot point at any of the dividing sections among those 3 acts. Act 1 is the story's setup block. This includes 3 aspects: exposition, the inciting incident, and the first plot point. For Spider-Man 2, exposition is covered within the first 15 minutes. and the audience is brought to speed on where every character is. Peter is struggling with maintaining a professional and personal life, and a life as Spider-Man. Harry Osborn is still holding a grudge against Spider-Man for the death of his father. Aunt May is having financial issues, and Mary Jane is seeing someone. All of these things affect the protagonist and must be resolved in one way or another by the movie's end. Also, through dialogue, the name Otto Octavius is mentioned, and therefore exposition has been covered. We then proceed into the inciting incident. This includes Peter's first meeting with Otto Octavius, followed by the first instance of his losing his powers. The first plot point lands during Otto's lab demonstration where his nuclear reactor malfunctions. Otto's wife, Rose, is killed, and then a set of mechanical arms are fused with Otto's body. When Editor-in-Chief J. Jonah Jameson announces the following,
Guy named Otto Octavius winds up with 8 limbs. What are the odds?
This is the movie outright signaling that we've reached the first plot point. JJ might as well have been talking to the audience here, because his dialogue is tailored as a setup for Act 2, at which point we are about 40 minutes into the movie, 1/3 and right on track. The fact that the movie pivots from each plot point, from the Bugle's perspective, is particularly creative. This is because the Bugle is a journalist organization and prints stories on a regular basis. While the audience is in on the action as we see it play out in real time, we also have a window into what New York City is reading on the day-to-day. There's also some thematic relevance in that the Bugle itself is torn between two visions of who Spider-Man is, even as Peter is being torn apart by his two identities.
Robbie, there's your page 1. Masked menace terrorizes town.
I told you he's not a menace.
And I told you.
I'll take care of it.
Act 2 is the story's confrontation block. This includes 3 aspects: rising action, the midpoint, and the second plot point. Rising action is covered by Aunt May's continuing financial woes and Otto's bank heist, followed by the planetarium party where Harry slaps Peter in a drunken rage, and John Jameson announces his engagement to MJ. And then at the movie's midpoint, roughly 1 hour into our 2-hour feature, Peter decides to stop being a Spider-Man and loses his powers. He has chosen to start life anew, ideally without the baggage of being a superhero. Yet his conscience is stricken. There's a rise in crime throughout New York City, and Peter is left unable to right the wrongs occurring around him. On top of that, Harry has also driven a wedge between them, and MJ is still getting married. Peter also confesses to Aunt May about what had happened the night Uncle Ben died, taking responsibility but briefly falling out of her good graces. Overall, Act 2 is extremely depressing, but eventually takes a turn for the better when the movie begins to transition into Act 3. And that transition begins with the meek intrusion of one Ursula Ditkovich at Peter's apartment. Peter, at his lowest state, is offered a piece of cake. Following this, he is reconciled with Aunt May, at which point Peter feels ready to get back into the thick of it. He wants to be Spider-Man again. At the end of Act 2, Peter is finally confronted with how he feels about MJ. But before a lid can be put on that, she is very suddenly captured by Doc Ock. And there our second plot point has been reached. Peter then reobtains his powers and retrieves his Spidey suit from the Daily Bugle. And this return to the Bugle signals the start of Act 3. Act 3 is the story's resolution block, and that includes 3 aspects: pre-climax, climax, and denouement. Pre-climax is the fight aboard the L train, while the climax is the entire encounter at Otto's lair. The denouement happens soon after the destruction of the second nuclear reactor, and Otto dies. We then reach a bittersweet resolution. Aunt May has found true closure to Uncle Ben's death, a pun of which can be found in the fact that her home was undergoing foreclosure. Her want to keep her home was a metaphor for her not letting go. Peter is also reconciled with MJ, and she decides not to go through with her engagement. Unfortunately, however, Harry has been left despondent, setting up the story for another antagonist. In all of these things, the main action of this story is centered on the character Peter Parker, our protagonist. And to clarify, the main action is what drives the story forward. In Spider-Man, the first movie, the driving force was Spider-Man, not necessarily Peter Parker. Spider-Man 2, on the other hand, has reversed this. Peter Parker has now become the driving force, and Spider-Man has taken a backseat. The first act typically starts with exposition, necessary for establishing the world of the story so that your audience may begin to settle in. Spider-Man 2 does this in the same manner as the first film had done, with Peter Parker awkwardly talking about Mary Jane. Peter's narration is funny in retrospect because in this and the first movie, he continually alludes to MJ as if she is the most important player in the story, when, in fact, he is. But part of this narration is due Peter's own sense of selflessness, but also establishes a classic central conflict. He's a hero torn between love and duty. So Peter's a pizza delivery boy, but he hasn't been making his deadlines. Now, first lapse of internal logic to note here is that Peter's boss takes the time to chew him out for being late to work, but for some reason continues to berate him while on a strict timetable. Here the want to exposit one's story is overriding the practicality of the situation. Another lapse here would be Peter somehow exiting a closet which a receptionist most surely would have seen Spider-Man enter early on. Now, if I were far more snarky and didn't care a whit about the medium in question, I might call these flaws in the writing and then climb aboard the high horse of my own sense of heavy-handed criticism. In truth, however, the story doesn't suffer as a result of these instances. These instances are not even major story events. They are extra dressing that aid in applying a tonal fundament to the movie. Regardless of these instances, the main action still proceeds as per normal. These first few scenes of the movie are made for the purpose of showing us how Spider-Man is interfering with Peter Parker's everyday life and routine. How well they serve that purpose is secondary to the purpose itself. There are any number of contexts to be utilized that otherwise could have conveyed the story forward, and the story itself wouldn't change much outside a skeletal framework. If one looks at a staged play, for instance, the freedom in following the main action becomes far more apparent. Staged plays often follow blocks of quotes written on sheets of paper, with sparse direction. Most of the direction is implied by the dialogue. There's plenty of creativity that may be employed beyond that. Anything else that happens on stage is secondary to what is primary, the main action. A critic may bemoan fake props and ill-shod sets, but none of that matters if the main action is still upheld. Apply the same rubric to a movie, Spider-Man 2. Much of what does or doesn't follow internal logic can be written differently or even written away entirely. But there's far more to a movie experience than consistent storytelling. For instance, this line
Pizza time.
is not essential to the story, yet its addition makes for a more worthwhile experience. Peter's fighting with the mops in the broom closet is also unessential, and may be impractical for reasons I've already stated, yet that doesn't matter so much as I'm laughing because Peter is such an awkward dunce. I'm invested in the illusion. I don't care whether or not it's practical. This is a melodramatic story, and therefore drama will always supersede logic. This is because melodrama has its own logic, applied liberally for the sake of making the movie a worthwhile experience.
It helps maintain the illusion.
Peter Parker is being split in half by his alternate identity, illustrated in microcosmic detail by the mixed views within the Daily Bugle. The newspaper's editor-in-chief, J. Jonah Jameson, constantly promotes the idea that Spider-Man is a menace to New York City, while others in his organization vehemently disagree.
Masked menace terrorizes town.
I told you he's not a menace.
Originally, this scene at the Bugle was written as the opening to the movie, with pizza time following thereafter. Every time the story makes a transition into another act, we cut to the Bugle, which, as I've noted, is appropriate given these journalists are also following the ongoing adventures of Spider-Man. Now, because of Spider-Man, Peter is unable to fulfill a great many obligations. At his local college, he runs into one Professor Curtis Connors, who scolds him for being late. Internal logic knocks again. Shouldn't Peter have known he was late? Classes can run from an hour to several hours. Was he really trying to beat the clock an hour or more after his class had started? Regardless, the main action is unaffected because the information being conveyed is clear. Spider-Man is complicating everything in Peter's life. That and the movie has the opportunity to drop Otto Octavius' name for the purposes of building up the movie's antagonist. Peter's relationships with his family and friends are also being hindered by Spider-Man. Granted, internal logic might dictate Harry Osborn not be confrontational toward Peter on his birthday, but at the same time, the writers need to bring the audience up to speed on how the events of the previous film are affecting the here and now. So Spider-Man has thrown a shadow over the friendship between Peter and Harry. Now, could that conflict have been better illustrated? Yes, of course, but the information is conveyed to the audience nevertheless, that's the point. And let's head on to the pile. Aunt May recalls Uncle Ben's death. Note how pointed the dialogue is here.
Can you believe that it's 2 years next month since he was taken?
And the writers are hitting us over the head with this one, but there's such writing as rife throughout Spider-Man 2. This is why I said this is a simple movie, a very simple movie. Ignore the irony that I'm spending a couple of hours talking about the movie in great detail. because the story is really not at all sophisticated. And that doesn't mean the story is bad, it simply means the average viewer is allowed to understand the story's contents. You don't need to be an intellectual to get it, in other words, and not everyone who watches movies is necessarily an intellectual. That's why melodrama is the go-to, by the way. On top of everything else, Peter then meets with Mary Jane Watson, and just like the end of the first film, he hides his true feelings for her. And there we are. We're about 15 minutes into the film, and the writers have brought the audience up to speed. Now the story can really and truly take place. So MJ announces that she's seeing someone. This is a stake among many that will compel future action by the protagonist. Peter is torn between his own desires and his duty as Spider-Man. Unfortunately, the way the scene is set up, MJ is made to appear emotionally manipulative. And I say appear because the film in no way addresses MJ's actions as being manipulative, even if they have that very effect. In the past, I've mentioned this as being a potential problem. How the writers set up detrimental aspects about a character, and yet they will make no effort to illustrate those detriments as having negative effects. In the case of Spider-Man 2, something somewhat different is going on. The writers are playing on long-standing tropes whose history stretches as far back as Shakespeare. To be clear, Spider-Man 2 is melodramatic, and what this means is that even the most basic tenets of human relationships are made to look highly sensationalized.
Get thee to another. Go. Farewell.
That's been the case since the first movie, by the way. In any given melodrama, characters will not act on practicality. And one supposes that if practicality had taken a front seat in all the storytelling here, then MJ would probably have known who Spider-Man was by simply recognizing his voice. And so when MJ vacillates between Peter and this someone else, one may see it as being emotionally manipulative from a practical standpoint, but not necessarily so from a melodramatic standpoint. You see, the reason practicality is abandoned here is partially due to the time constraints of a movie. Reality must therefore become hyper-reality, moving at 100 miles per hour. Melodramatic constraints may also account for why Green Goblin and Doc Ock do not remove Spider-Man's mask. With regard to practicality, that act would defeat the melodramatic underpinning. This is how you create a mythology, by the way. Spider-Man's mask becomes far more than a piece of cloth covering Peter Parker's face. In retrospect, the importance of melodrama was something that was avidly promoted by Stan Lee, with regard to such coincidences as having all of Spider-Man's villains be so closely acquainted with Peter Parker. Stan Lee capitalized on having every conflict become as personal as possible, regardless of the impracticality of it all. Aside from the general melodrama, the Shakespearean influence is also apparent. MJ's greatest enemy here is her own ignorance, derived from Peter's hiding his secret identity from her. Likewise, many of Shakespeare's plays hinge on what characters do or do not know.
How have you made division of yourself? Which is Sebastian?
Often the characters hiding who they truly are want to capitalize on the ignorance of others. But sometimes, playing two-faced games can also lead to all kinds of problems. Problems that then result in tragic or comedic outcomes.
Hast thou yet charmed the Athenians' eyes with the love juice as I did bid thee do?
I took him sleeping. That is finished too. And the Athenian woman by his side. So when he wakes, by him she must be eyed.
What hast thou done? Thou hast mistaken quite, and laid the love juice on some true love sight.
Aside from melodrama, here's another term to familiarize oneself with: hamartia. Hamartia means to have missed the mark. In a dramatic setting, hamartia refers to a grave error or sin, often committed by the story's protagonist.
How does that feel? I wouldn't!
You'd leave a man's life to chance.
This error results in a chain reaction whose repercussions affect the entire story.
It's not about what I want. It's about what's fair! The world is cruel, and the only morality in a cruel world is chance.
What then is Peter's hamartia in Spider-Man 2? One may assert Peter's lying to his friends and family is where the ignorance stems from, which then causes the ongoing consternation among them. There are also various visual gags rife throughout the film that can be attributed to Peter's hamartia. For instance, Peter repeatedly tries to snatch the remaining hors d'oeuvres from various party plates, and very literally misses the mark every time. Incidentally, this happens 3 times, which may symbolize the 3 most important people in his life: Aunt May, Harry Osborn, and Mary Jane Watson. All three are suffering as well, entirely due secrets that Peter is keeping from them. Aunt May needs closure for Uncle Ben's death. Harry wants revenge for his father's death. And MJ wants to be with Spider-Man. To be clear, MJ's manipulation, Harry's anger, and Aunt May's depression all stem from one central point. Peter is lying to them all. And with all this in mind, Peter's loss of his powers can be further seen as a consequence for his hamartia, for his sin. So let's wind down the introduction and head straight into the inciting incident. Peter returns to his inglorious apartment where he finds that his rent is past due. Another drop in the bucket of his ongoing issues. Concerning that, the original script had Peter staying with Harry at his penthouse, although this was under heavy scrutiny given Harry had become paranoid following his father's death. And in retrospect, if the story had gone in that direction, we would have had more opportunities to see their friendship fleshed out. Note as Peter settles in for the night, we can also hear the rumble of the New York City L train, which foreshadows a future confrontation with Dr. Octopus. Then we fade to black, which concludes our introduction. We know who our players are, and now the game may begin. The next day, we are formally introduced to Otto Octavius, and he and Peter get to know one another.
Well, it won't take much of your time.
Parker, now I remember you. You're Connor's student. Tells me you're brilliant.
Following a show-don't-tell axiom, Peter should have been allowed to display his brilliance, rather than have Otto remark on it expositorily.
Well, being brilliant's not enough, young man. You have to work hard. Intelligence is not a privilege, it's a gift. And you use it for the good of mankind.
All this talk about intelligence being a gift echoes the commission given to Peter by Uncle Ben, and so Peter would take it to heart. Otto's words are then brought to bear near the end of the film through Peter, who thereby convinces Otto of his own failure to adhere to a moral mandate. Now here I'll zero in on what kind of message the writers are keen on conveying to their audience. Otto attributes Peter's intelligence to having been brought about by more than random chance. In other words, calling his brilliance a gift implies a higher power is present. Even as Uncle Ben's words gave Peter a purpose, Otto's words have a similar effect. And the moral vision being attended to here is a Christian one, albeit the writers are tiptoeing around its origins. I shall expound upon that a bit more as I continue. As we move on, Peter's continued conversation with Otto eventually leads him to being invited to Otto's home. Briefly, we meet Otto's wife, Rose. Now, Peter voices his concerns about the safety of Otto's nuclear reactor, but Otto assures him that he has everything under control, albeit he does not elaborate farther than saying he has done the calculations. Rose then decides to change the subject and asks Peter if he has a girlfriend. Naturally, Peter becomes evasive. Otto then, very pointedly, gives Peter some advice.
Love should never be a secret. If you keep something as complicated as love stored up inside, it's gonna make you sick.
A line that serves as foreshadowing for future events, but also offers as good an explanation as any for why Peter will lose his powers. This entire meeting with Otto would constitute the inciting action of the first act. And just as a reminder, the inciting action is the moment where the main character is confronted with a dynamic event he will shortly be made to deal with. Otto and his nuclear reactor are that dynamic event. Now, part of what makes our villain's setup effective is that Peter clearly aspires to be like Otto, thereby connecting the protag with the antag along motivational parallels. That's a point I've made amidst my commentaries, that the protag should be fighting himself or his own values even as he fights the antag. Face your enemy, face yourself. And here the viewing audience knows, or rather feels, what is coming down the road, despite whatever reassurances that Otto wants to give Peter. Therefore, we can readily assign Otto's line about doing the calculations as not but his own vanity speaking. Pride comes before the inevitable fall. Now, Peter also admires Otto for the fact that with Rose, Otto has achieved a balance between love and duty, or at least seemingly so. Even as Otto attends to his professional life as a nuclear scientist, he also has a wife to come home to. Through Otto, Peter sees everything he wants in life. Now, if only Spider-Man wasn't always keeping him from achieving his lofty goals. Later into the day, Peter gets ready to see MJ's play, and there's a theme that plays out as clearly as the two suits that hang within his closet. The lyrics to an ongoing song entitled Hold On make everything even more abundantly clear. Even the play that Peter is attending works its way into thematic relevance as well. The importance of being earnest just so happens to be MJ's play. For anyone unfamiliar with the importance of being earnest, one of the main characters maintains a fictitious persona in order to escape the social conventions of his country life.
Besides, your name isn't Jack at all, it's Ernest.
It isn't Alice, it's Jack.
You've always told me it was Ernest.
Well, it is Ernest in town and Jack in the country, and the cigarette case was given to me in the country.
And so on the nose, the play's context is relevant to Peter's own situation. Spider-Man 2 is an absurdly simple movie, without much sophistication. Everything is spelled out for us. And please note that I'm not speaking pejoratively about this when I say that Spider-Man 2 is a simple movie. There's nothing inherently bad about simplicity. Now, I personally don't prefer my movies that way, in large part because I like to think that I'm a sophisticated person. In cases like Spider-Man 2, I like to go with what Red Letter Media has said about blockbuster schlock.
The brilliant, complex, and challenging falls to the wayside, while the safe and the familiar is the norm. We're mostly creatures of habit, and we're all average. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Anyway, Peter is on his way to MJ's play, and as fate would have it, he becomes distracted by a police chase. This causes him to come in late, and he's disallowed to enter the theater. Internal logic here asking why he couldn't just sneak in through the roof as Spider-Man, or maybe through a window, or any other means of entering the building. Yet the reason we don't follow internal logic here is due to melodrama.
It helps maintain the illusion.
Peter needs to fail and be given reasons to abandon his other identity. Of course, he could have told MJ someone crashed into his scooter, which would have been truthful, and he could have even shown her the remains. Note that he does try this later, but his words fail him. MJ won't listen to him.
I've been reading poetry lately.
Whatever that means.
Do not cast pearls before swine. And what that means is that if people are not listening to you, stop talking to them.
And so feeling dejected, Peter elects to conclude the night as Spider-Man and follow another set of police cars. But suddenly as he swings, his webbing gives out, causing him to fall. He is then left to walk home in shambles. Now let's talk for a moment about Peter's sudden loss of powers. There exists no explanation for why it happens, and so must therefore be left to interpretation. What we do know is that he gained his powers through genetic mutation, well established in the first film. However, Spider-Man 2 gives his powers a kind of ephemeral attribution, and Peter gains and loses them depending on his spiritual state of being. And I will go into greater detail about that as I continue. For now, one should be aware that this is the way the movie has set things up. Now the next day, Peter tries calling MJ but reaches her voicemail. Left frustrated after the payphone drops his call, Peter then pretends to have a conversation with her, where he goes on to reveal his identity and explains why he can't be with her. Now juxtapose this scene with the end of the first movie and Peter's motivations become confusing. And maybe that's the point, but nevertheless, I'll spell out what I mean here. Lest anyone forget, Peter rejected MJ in the first place. He was made well aware of her feelings early on.
The truth is, I love you.
So this whole point about him trying to regain her affection is strange, because that had already been accomplished. After all, he is the one who convinced himself that things couldn't work in the first place, and so straight up told MJ that friendship was all that he had to give. So my question here is, why is he trying to regain her affections? You see, Peter self-mandated that he remain in the friend zone. Therefore, to what end is he learning poetry and making all these promises to spend more time with her? Here I can determine that Peter is conflicted about his own feelings, which is understandable. In hindsight, however, his playing on both sides of the fence makes him emotionally manipulative, which would then coincide with MJ's own manipulations. Now all these conventions go against practicality, but this is melodrama, and characters need to have these bouts of irrational emotional turmoil, because love do be making us do crazy things sometimes. And so we cut to Otto's lab, where he's about to demonstrate the power of his tritium nuclear reactor. When Otto addresses his audience, he starts with a joke.
Before we start, has anybody lost a large roll of $20 bills in a rubber band? Because we found the rubber band.
And one might not think much of this joke other than to attribute a sense of humor to Otto, except one should also remember this scene.
Here, kiddo, happy birthday. You need it more than I do.
No, I can't take that.
Yes, you can. You can take this money from me. For God's sake, it's not much. Now take it.
This all plays into Otto being an ideal that Peter is chasing. In other words, Peter is doing everything he can just to keep up with rent, while Otto can make jokes about finding wads of cash around his lap. Otto then removes a drape covering a set of 4 mechanical arms. Baffling about this entire demonstration is that these arms ought to have been a marvel, no pun intended, in technological engineering outside what Otto was doing with nuclear fusion. On the spot, Otto allows himself to be strapped into this apparatus, which then threads several needles into his spinal cord. Matter-of-factly, Otto talks about how the arms work, and the only question of concern that is asked is this.
Doctor, if the artificial intelligence in the arms is as advanced as you suggest, couldn't that make you vulnerable to them?
Really? That's the only question? How about asking about how much pain he should be in right now? Spinal injections are no walk in the park.
You may also feel pain shooting down your legs during the procedure, or develop a headache after the procedure.
What kind of drugs is Otto on that would allow him to endure that kind of pain? And as I issued, these arms are revolutionary in terms of modern tech. Otto could foster an entire line of prosthetics using this same technology, but nobody brings that up? Again, it is amazing to me how readily the story just glosses over the very existence of these arms.
Most of this stuff is old crap my dad left behind.
Doc, you have a table over there with a sign that says Laser Death Ray Bargain Bin.
Referring back to the original script, the arms were in fact what Otto had originally chosen to demonstrate. Unfortunately, using them came at great physical and psychological cost. And with regard to how much pain Otto should be in right now, the original script even covered that detail. Yet as we can see here, none of those details made it into the final movie, and we're left with this miraculous invention being used as a mere appliance to another miraculous invention. Well, regardless of all that, Otto reassures the people that he has invented an inhibitor chip to quell any attempt by the mechanical arms to take over his brain. So I guess we can all just breathe a sigh of relief. But in fact, this just puts us deeper into the proverbial rabbit hole. We have all these passive acknowledgments that some kind of sentience exists within this technology, which is yet another miraculous invention. So again, forget about the nuclear reactor for a moment and realize Otto has invented an entire artificial life form, grafted it onto his body in a matter of seconds, and yet nobody bats an eye?
It helps maintain the illusion.
Now, on top of everything else, let us also appreciate the fact that Otto is messing around with radioactive materials in an environment that offers no protection from radiation. That and his experiment is being conducted in the middle of New York City. In terms of degrading internal logic, the scene takes the cake, no pun intended. Making the case for melodrama is also difficult here, considering Otto specifically said that his arms were made of a non-magnetic material, which means he knew the nuclear core would be magnetic. Given that, it's further surprising that he conducted this experiment with all these metal objects nearby. Future dialogue also indicates that some of the people there did indeed realize the potential damage a nuclear reaction could wreak upon the city.
That was too close. He had more than a drop of tritium. He could have destroyed the city.
Yet they let it continue. In hindsight, the experiment would have been far more appropriate to conduct in, say, the Nevada desert, or some other isolated part of the country. With regard to all that, we do have scenes such as the military testing special armor in isolation that happens in the first movie. And even Sandman gets his powers in the third movie thanks to his falling into a testing facility that is also isolated from local civilization. And so one wonders why all these precautions were abandoned when Otto Octavius and his nuclear reactor were concerned.
I certainly know the consequences of the slightest miscalculation.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to question you.
Rosie, our new friend thinks I'm gonna blow up the city.
Anyway, the reactor destabilizes and goes critical. Even so, Otto refuses to shut it down. Eventually, the metal frames of the glass doors nearby are drawn into the core, causing shards to pour into the room. On instinct, Otto shields himself with his new arms, but he fails to protect his wife, who is summarily impaled. Now keep in mind the fact that Otto's first instinct was to protect himself, and not his wife. Imagine if this had been Peter and MJ. No doubt Peter would have rushed to her in an instant, even at the cost of his own life. Otto, on the other hand, openly marveled at the prospect of wielding the power of the sun. Yet with that great power, Otto withheld all responsibility. And so even as Otto is an ideal that Peter strives for, Otto has now set himself up as antithesis to Spider-Man. Thankfully, Spider-Man manages to shut down the reactor before any major damage can be done to the city, but not before Otto is electrified. The mechanical arms then fuse with his spine and the inhibitor chip on his back is destroyed. Otto is then taken to a hospital where his arms become fully sentient, and they secure his escape. Here I suppose I should acknowledge just how outlandishly violent Otto's breakout is in comparison to all the lighthearted elements that are otherwise instilled in the movie. Given this scene marks a transition between Act 1 and 2, we're no doubt meant to be aware of just how serious matters have become. Now the movie is leading its audience into far more dramatic circumstances. Peter has a new villain to fight, and therefore a new call to action. The twist, however, is that he's about to lose his powers. Part of determining where each act in a story begins and then transitions into the next is based on the movie's running time. Now, if a movie is 2 hours long or 120 minutes, and we are following a 3-act structure, then each act should occur within an average of 40 minutes. As an example, almost exactly, the second act of Star Wars occurs around its 40-minute mark. The transition follows the tragedy of the loss of Luke's aunt and uncle. That is Luke's call to action. In Spider-Man 2, we are about 40 minutes into the movie, and J. Jonah Jameson lays things out for us.
Guy named Otto Octavius winds up with 8 limbs. What are the odds?
Incidentally, each act is initiated by a cut to the Daily Bugle, which is appropriate given they're journalists. Now, unlike Luke Skywalker, who took some direct action in Star Wars, Peter Parker is a passive actor, but that's in keeping with his character. He's a passive actor while Spider-Man is not, and so instead of going out to find Otto and bring him to justice, Peter just wanders into JJ's office and is told where to go and what to do next. And that's how he met Otto, remember? He just happened to mention him to Harry, and Harry was the one who set up their meeting. And the only time Peter goes from passive actor to active actor is during the 3rd act. And I will get to that in due course. Anyway, JJ tells Peter to attend a planetarium party because, conveniently, another photographer wasn't able to make it. The planetarium party is where JJ's son John is to be celebrated for his recent moon landing. Conveniently, MJ and Harry will be there as well. Now here one might expect me to criticize the story for all these little conveniences, but I won't. Why? Because I talked about melodrama, didn't I? This story is basically one big soap opera. That's why all these conveniences exist. They're made to prop up a sensational story, not a practical one. Now let's talk about J. Jonah Jameson for a bit. To be clear, JJ is insane.
How dare you come in here and ask me for a job? I'm the editor-in-chief. I know the mayor of Venus. Hamburgers can see the future. Rosie...
Sorry about this. We share the building with a mental hospital.
That's not exactly what I mean here. Better terminology would be that he is bipolar or schizophrenic. But that's appropriate given the nature of his outlet, the Daily Bugle, which embodies 2 or more sides of any ongoing story. Stanley's conception of JJ's character captures the bitter nature of the news media. The conceit is that JJ is only interested in morality from a perspective that it works to engage a prospective audience.
Journalism is a branch of entertainment, and one watches the evening news and sees story after story after story that is selected and positioned and prioritized on those network news broadcasts for entertainment value.
And so he says Spider-Man is a villain because he believes the narrative works better if Spider-Man is a villain. And he persecutes Spider-Man in this way because he can also reap in the contentious results of illustrating a moral do-gooder as a villain. Deep down, JJ realizes Spider-Man is a moral person and so will take the punches. Therefore, JJ keeps the punches coming.
You've turned the whole city against him.
A fact I'm very proud of. Now, get your pretty little portfolio off my desk before I go into a diabetic coma.
The best way to understand JJ and the Bugle is that the news media is not an organization made for the purpose of revealing truth, or even conveying information. The news media is in the entertainment business, and therefore must illustrate every story from a dramatic standpoint. That way, an audience is kept engaged. They want to follow the story. And so that's the way JJ's mind works. He's not at all interested in the truth of the matter. He's solely interested in the spectacle. He can care less about who he hurts along the way. Anyway, let's get back to Otto, who we find is left to contemplate everything that had just happened to him. His wife died and his entire tritium dream was flushed down the drain. Now he has 4 mechanical arms fused with his spine. Given all this, Otto's reaction is extremely subdued here. Alfred Molina is a terrific actor, so it's surprising he wasn't made to bawl his eyes out over the tragedy that his life has become. Even his shouting "no" as he wakes up in the hospital comes across as silly. Maybe that was the point. True too, Otto throws some quips around as well.
Butterfingers.
Now granted, one could attribute this behavior to the influence of the mechanical arms, but I'm not talking about Otto's behavior from a standpoint of whether or not it makes sense in the movie. I'm I'm talking about Otto's behavior from a standpoint that the writing could have capitalized on his loss more effectively by giving him an entirely different disposition. Down the road, I'll be making a point about this concerning Harry Osborn's loss of his father. In either case, the losses only serve the point of spurring either character into becoming a bad guy, and that's about the extent of it. The movie never truly emphasizes the pain these characters go through, at least not as powerfully as we're meant to feel so from Peter's standpoint when he held his uncle's hand in his last moments. There's a connection to be made between the main character and the villain along these lines. Otto's line of work caused the death of his wife. Peter's own line of work, as embodied by Spider-Man, could cause the death of MJ. Through Otto, Peter has a vision of the road he dare not tread, and so he has a greater degree of justification for why he refuses to be with MJ. Now, given the loss of the inhibitor chip, the tentacles are now able to enter Otto's mind. And as I said before, this should be a miracle of technological engineering, yet receives little examination. And so I've elected to see the tentacles as being allegorical to demonic influence, removing Otto's inhibitions and allowing the true man to come forth.
Me, your greatest creation. Bringing you what you've always wanted. Power.
In reality, the Green Goblin was Norman, but the Norman beneath the surface. By God's grace, people can keep their innermost thoughts and feelings at bay and hidden away. Not so for Norman or Otto, for their vanity worked to unchain the beast within. Under the auspices of his uncle's last words to him, Peter is the only superpowered party among these three who shows any restraint. For Norman and Otto, there's a Jekyll and Hyde element here. The voices that they hear are actually their own voices. Voices of ambition, unabated by morality. Now, the original script for Spider-Man 2 takes Otto's condition much farther, involving the use of drugs. In comparison to the movie, the original script is far more grounded in a scientific angle, rather than a magical or spiritual one. In other words, the conventions of practicality were subdued, and what we have instead here are strange demonic voices coming from the Antag's mechanical arms. Much of this should be kept in mind with regard to examining Spider-Man 2 under the scope of practicality. Speaking of practicality, we come to the bank heist scene. Note that I posted an edit of this scene on my channel, which was an attempt to re-examine it under a more practical lens. This edit doesn't change any of the dynamics of the story. It simply strives for a more consistent internal logic. Briefly, I'll explain my choices in editing. First off, there is an aspect left unaccounted for, which is explaining how Otto was able to hide the bulk of his mechanical arms underneath his trench coat. Somehow he does this, and he's able to walk around New York City and enter the bank without being found out. People surely would have taken notice. Next, I cut the part where the security guards tell him to put his arms up, given how incompetent this makes them appear, and Otto ends up knocking them away anyway. The NYPD are equally made to look like buffoons later on. Next, I cut the part where Spider-Man tosses a money bag at Otto. A section of the wall here is obliterated by the blow, but Otto just shakes it off. Now, this is related to an ongoing problem. The movie's logic assumes Otto is just like Spider-Man and that he is able to withstand this damage that would otherwise severely harm or kill an ordinary man. On top of this, Otto will have been thrown out a window, into an electrical box, and then into the side of a taxi. Following that, he takes multiple punches from Spider-Man, and none of it makes any sense because Otto is supposed to be just a man. He does have the mechanical arms, of course, but the arms have not given his physical form any kind of outrageous resilience. And if that were the case, would not the movie have most certainly included some kind of explanation? But as far as we know, the arms are his only asset. We don't know how his body holds up to all the clobbering he receives. It just does. Now, the original script indicates that Otto was artificially boosting his endorphins, which may have been a partial explanation, although boosting endorphins would only explain resistance to pain, and not resistance to the actual damage inflicted. In other words, Otto could take a hit to the face and keep fighting, but he would still lose some teeth in the process. In hindsight, Otto should have also been given some kind of armor, something he would have also worn at the lab to keep him protected from nuclear radiation. In fact, Oscorp was already making combat armor, a variant of which was worn by Norman Osborn as the Green Goblin. Could Otto have worn something like that? Moving on, another cut I made was the moment where Otto takes Spidey's face into his claws in a vice grip. This edit was done in response to the fact that Otto will later reveal that he has metal spikes embedded within each arm. Why he even has those spikes is not explained. Incidentally, I also edited out the scene where the spike is even revealed. And if it isn't obvious, the existence of these spikes just begs the question as to why Otto never uses them in any situation where they would be warranted.
It helps maintain the illusion.
And as a note to the melodramatic nature of the movie, the spike is only ever used to coincide with how much tension need be instilled in the moment. In terms of its practical application, however, Otto never takes the opportunity to impale Spidey with it. Another cut, the useless NYPD officers telling Otto to freeze and then refusing to fire on him as he reaches into the crowd for a hostage. Here I'm getting flashbacks of the SWAT Cat's enforcers.
Warning, you're under arrest. Drop the mouse.
Another cut is the ruckus Otto makes as he climbs the building, given how this method of scaling the building clashes with any other instance where the movie wants us to believe that he is somehow traversing New York City without any commotion. Next, I cut out the scene where Otto drops Aunt May, given there's an incredible amount of leeway between his dropping her, Spider-Man catching her, and Otto doing nothing in reaction. I cut another chunk for Spider-Man repeatedly smacking Otto in the face. Otto remains undamaged by all this too, despite his complete lack of any superpowered mutations. Again, all he has is 4 metal arms attached to his spine. Something funny to note here is that even Otto's glasses stay intact, but they eventually do break when Aunt May hits him with her umbrella. Not when Spider-Man punches him in the face. Then again, maybe Aunt May has been juicing, who knows. And then the final cut was Otto's unsheathing a blade within one of his arms, for reasons I already outlined. Again, none of these edits change the story at all. Otto still gets away with the money and is made to rub an ongoing grudge with Spider-Man. The finer details are up for any number of additions along the way, but the important thing is that the story remains intact. Admittedly, this is why I don't majorly concern myself with lapses in internal logic or practicality, at least not unless the writing is actively contradicting itself. I've already mentioned one instance of this, and that's Otto specifically telling people that his arms are non-ferromagnetic, which does not account for the fact that a computer nearby the nuclear reactor was magnetic and almost kills Harry when it's pulled into the miniature sun. It's like building a motor vehicle with seatbelts but no windshield. But if you go down the rabbit hole of internal logic, you won't come out again. There's no end to how much movies don't coincide with reality. A major concession is obvious. Movies are decidedly not reality, and so expecting an outrageous degree of reality from them is, well, unrealistic. At the planetarium party, Peter is made to take pictures of the surrounding guests. Harry is also there, getting drunk off champagne. Now, here's some facts about champagne. In terms of alcohol by volume, or ABV, champagne contains an average 12%. That's about as much as your average bottle of wine. Champagne is also carbonated, which has been assumed to cause the alcohol to reach your head faster than wine or liquor would. Whether or not that's actually the case, people do tend to drink champagne faster than other alcoholic beverages, which would no doubt get you drunk faster. Depending on your level of tolerance, 2 glasses of champagne, or about half a pint, would get you drunk. You down an entire bottle and you run the risk of becoming blackout drunk given how quickly the alcohol will hit you.
So Harry should have blacked out, right? He should be stumbling around. He should be slurring his words. He should be an absolute wreck, right? But he's not. Oh no. This isn't logical. This is terrible. Who wrote this? Sam Raimi? Michael Chabon? What are you all doing? But you know, I'm a smart person. The movie can't fool me. Alcohol doesn't work that way. I've done my research. I'm a good critic.
Now you might ask, where am I going with this tangent? Well, I'm using it as an example of just how far one can travel down the rabbit hole of internal logic. There are so many singular aspects about any story that can be torn to shreds by simply investigating internal logic. And as a result, one can call a movie a failure, a travesty, or whatever. Or on the other hand, one can understand that Harry is angry and is readily driving a wedge between himself and Peter over Spider-Man. The alcohol then becomes a symbol rather than a practical appliance. There exists a certain subset of criticism that attends to internal logic or practicality, as if that's everything to a story. Writers are not required to imbue an overabundance of sophisticated practicality into their work just because a small number of self-aggrandized critics want that or believe that the movie should work according to those rules.
It helps maintain the illusion.
As Peter continues taking pictures of the guests about the party, an announcer introduces John Jameson, a dashing astronaut and son of J. Jonah Jameson. John strides confidently down a stairwell to huge applause. But Peter is left stunned when he sees that MJ is at his side. Soon afterward, Peter meets with MJ and attempts to apologize for missing her play. Awkwardly, he tries to recite poetry to her, but MJ just shuts him down. Specifically, MJ tells him she doesn't know who he is, which is spot on because the truth of the matter is, Peter doesn't know himself. MJ's shutdown is compounded later on by a drunken Harry slapping Peter, followed then by John Jameson announcing his engagement to MJ. Was it not but a couple of days ago that MJ had dropped the information on Peter that she was seeing someone? Given the engagement, the implication would be that MJ and John had been seeing each other for quite some time. Otherwise, are we to assume that MJ is the kind of person who would just leap into this marriage without at least getting to know John over the course of, months to years? This adds on to early assertions about how the writing makes MJ appear to be manipulative. In other words, just days after telling Peter she was seeing someone, now we're told she's about to get married to that someone. Incidentally, there are a myriad of cases in reality where couples have fallen in love and gotten married within days of their first date. In such cases, one wonders if they were too caught up in their own sense of melodrama, regardless of reality. Ultimately, the intent here is to induce rising action, and so the stakes are increased. Peter stands to lose MJ forever. That's what's important here. However, this depiction does come at great cost, as it makes MJ out to be extremely fickle. Conceivably, the writers could have written her as being willing to wait forever, if only Spider-Man would come sweep her off her feet, and no damage would be done. However, this would go against the grain, as this is the kind of drama that will tip Peter off the edge. And it's at this point in time that Peter's powers really and truly begin to diminish. His webbing gives out and his ability to scale walls is reduced, and his eyesight becomes blurred. On top of every other insult during the course of the night, Peter discovers that the Daily Bugle has also inculpated Spider-Man for the recent bank heist by Dr. Octopus. Referring back to the three-act structure, we've reached the midpoint of the story at this time, culminating with Peter's complete loss of his powers. And the story takes an interesting turn here in that the rising action peters out. What I mean is that rather than having the tension continue to rise, we are instead welcomed back into the mundane world of Peter Parker, where we get a window into what his new life could be. Majorly, the writers took a huge risk here in having the story go in this direction. After all, a break in the action to watch a wimpy Peter Parker try to separate himself from the amazing Spider-Man would probably not bode too well for an audience coming to a movie with Spider-Man in its title. Nevertheless, the movie not only did well during its release, but it maintains a cult appeal to this very day. People loved and continue to love this film, even if it defied conventions a bit. So Otto has a bunch of hardware mailed to him from who knows where. One wonders how all these transactions worked and why nobody would have taken notice that someone was making large purchases of all this equipment for who knows what reason. On top of all of that, Otto would have had to cash in all these gold coins he stole. Naturally, in light of this bank heist, witnessing a large transaction of gold coins would make anyone suspicious. For that matter, who is Otto buying all this hardware from in the first place? Under what name? To what address would they be sending it? Now, a way to fix this would be to include some kind of shady dealer who might have gotten the necessary parts for Otto. A scene might have played out like this.
Let's talk business. It's worth billions. Now, so are you.
Then again, the extra details may have been distracting. They may have introduced unnecessary elements to the movie. And so the only concern the movie has is that Doc Ock is concocting a master plan that threatens New York City. The finer details are unimportant. All we need to know is that Otto is the bad guy and he's continuing to do bad things. He'll be a threat in the future. That information is conveyed, locked into our minds, and the story moves on. Now, given his recent loss of powers, Peter decides to visit a doctor who tells him that there's nothing physically wrong with him. Awkwardly, Peter tries telling him about his troubles as Spider-Man without unveiling his secret identity. The doctor then becomes psychological and hits the nail on the head by asserting Peter is having an identity crisis. This is yet another instance where the movie ties Spider-Man to a spiritual state of being, and not merely a genetic mutation.
That'll make you mad not to know who you are. Your soul disappears. Nothing as bad as uncertainty.
However, in Peter's consternation, the doctor gives him the worst advice possible. Reassurance of Peter's own autonomy.
You always have a choice, Peter.
I have a choice.
So here Peter is being poisoned by philosophy and vanity. Admittedly, the doctor isn't being malicious here, he's simply conveying common cultural rudiments to his patient. Unfortunately, this means Peter is being given a reason to depart from his uncle's commission, which in effect would destroy his essential self. And then what follows this scene is one reminiscent of Peter's final interaction with his uncle before Ben died. The dreamlike quality of this scene puts a heavier emphasis on the spiritual aspect of Spider-Man. This also heavily departs from the original script, where much of Peter's journey was emphasized by the biological aspects of his mutation. Incidentally, the journey of Peter Parker is a deconstruction of the classic Disney motif about following your heart, or being whatever it is you want to be. That's an interesting detail to consider with regard to Sony's ownership of the character, and Disney's trying to make the character part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But Peter's departure from Spider-Man comes about as a result of self-deceit. Peter believes he can find meaning within himself. Philosophically, this is known as existentialism, which promotes that what gives your existence any meaning is the very exertion of your free will.
You always have a choice, Peter.
I have a choice.
I started talking about all this in reference to Otto's telling Peter that his intelligence is a gift.
Well, being brilliant's not enough, young man. You have to work hard. Intelligence is not a privilege, it's a gift. And you use it for the good of mankind.
Inescapable here is the fact that the writers have simultaneously made Spider-Man a result of genetic mutation, but also a spiritual state of being. Let's break that down a bit. There are two perspectives here when it comes to addressing Peter's powers. On the one hand, he received his powers by random chance through genetic mutation. On the other hand, Uncle Ben's words to him indicate that there was something more to Peter's abilities. Therefore, Uncle Ben commissioned Peter to take responsibility for the powers bestowed upon him. And so, as evidenced by the loss of Peter's powers, the story makes the case that it was Uncle Ben's commission, aside from the genetic mutation, that allowed Peter to retain those powers. A method of understanding what's going on here is to look at it from the perspective of a knight forsaking his knighthood, or more specifically King Arthur disposing of Excalibur. For a knight is commissioned by his king, and by extension he is also commissioned by the church and Christ to fulfill his duties and live by a code of honor. This is why Peter's powers have transcended their physical boundaries, and essentially been made analogous to faith in God.
Gonna make you mad not to know who you are. Your soul disappears.
That's also what is entailed by Otto's calling Peter's brilliance a gift. The implication being that what Peter has was granted to him by God. This is compounded by the fact that Otto also says that the gift is not Peter's to do with what he wants. It's not autonomous. He doesn't tell Peter he has a choice, he straight up says,
And you use it for the good of mankind.
Now keep all this in mind, as it will be continuing this topic as the story moves along. Peter disposes of his Spider-Man suit shortly after his visit to the doctor and his vision of Uncle Ben. A montage follows thereafter, showing Peter's life is slowly returning to normal, accentuated by the song Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head by B.J. Thomas. Among other things, the song is juxtaposed by a scene where Peter's content to snack on a hot dog as he watches police cars pass by. Appropriately, the lyrics indicate the singer is mocking the sun for not revealing itself, as if by some measure his rebuking the sun holds sway over it. That holds some thematic relevance to Peter believing he can just give up on being Spider-Man. But can he really? And true enough, Peter believes himself safe within the comfort of his self-imposed existential autonomy. To cap things off, Peter takes time out of his day to watch MJ's play, which surprises and pleases her greatly. Afterwards, they're walking down the street and Peter does his best to convey his feelings toward her, to let her know that he has changed.
We never got on. You can't get off if you don't get on, Peter.
I don't think it's that simple.
Of course you don't, because you complicate things. I love you. You complicate things.
She's waiting for you, pal. What do you mean?
You complicate things. I liked seeing you tonight, Peter. You complicate things. I'm seeing somebody now.
You mean like a boyfriend?
Well, like I like him. You complicate things.
What's also implied but not so much explored by the movie is the fact that MJ herself has also changed. Peter says he always imagined her getting married on a hilltop but hadn't settled on who the groom would be. This could be Peter dancing around the subject of being the groom himself, but it also infers that Peter had always seen MJ as being far more independent and carefree. Now, as far as the Raimi trilogy is concerned, there's been an ongoing issue with fleshing out MJ's character. She is a bit more than a standard love interest, but not enough to warrant as heavy an audience's investment as the writers seem to be imposing on us. The irony here is that Peter has always insisted, tongue-in-cheek, that the story is about her. But as we know, he only says this because she is all that he can think about. So Peter is turned down again here, but MJ ends their conversation by noting that she can indeed see that he has changed. Then almost as soon as she's off, Peter puts back on his glasses, indicating he's still compelled to retain some semblance of who he was before. The next day, the Bugle gets a hold of Spidey's suit, which JJ hangs on his wall like a trophy. The press then publishes a story about it, which in hindsight is something Peter probably should have thought of before rashly throwing his suit in the trash. But further piquing Peter's conscience is witnessing someone being mugged in an alleyway, and he just walks away. Some critics have indicated here that Peter's inaction is in direct conflict with his character, and also works in heavy contrast with his later saving a child from a burning building. However, what should also be obvious here is the fact that if Peter was in character, he would never have stopped being Spider-Man. This is the whole point of this sequence. Peter made a conscious trade-off in values, and now he is being haunted by his decision. His heart says one thing, but his head is telling him something else. One should realize that it's the entire idea of what a character crisis is. Peter knows what he should do, but voluntarily chooses not to do it. This is not because he is afraid to, but because he does not want to go back down that path. In other words, the entire point of this scene is to show that Peter is acting out of character, and how that is turning out to be a very bad thing for a great many people. Anyway, we cut to a scene at the graveyard where Peter and Aunt May pay their respects to Uncle Ben. Pointedly, Aunt May blames herself for Ben's death. Now, May's blaming herself for this is yet another jab at Peter's conscience, which will lead to his confession here in a moment. However, in what world would May have ever conceived that Ben's death was her fault? It's not like anyone could have predicted the carjacking and the shooting.
You wanted to take the subway and he wanted to drive you. If only I had stopped him.
I mean, Ben could have very well been stabbed and mugged on the subway as well. Point is that the story is being very forceful in making Peter feel guilty, and so Peter admits that he is the one responsible and explains the circumstances surrounding Ben's death. Amazingly, Aunt May just accepts everything she's being told, and she doesn't ask any questions like, what was Peter doing to get the money? Moreover, she doesn't inquire about what happened to the shooter afterwards. Granted, all of these are distractions, and the story does not want to get caught up in those details. What matters instead is that Peter has given his aunt some closure, albeit May, in shock, gets up and leaves without saying anything in response. Following this, we see that Otto has completed construction of his nuclear containment field, this one being larger than the last. And here it's quite astonishing that there wouldn't be people supervising New York City's power supplies, not taking notice of a distinct energy spike coming from Otto's location, and wondering what the hell is going on here. Regardless, all that's left for Otto to do now is locate the tritium, the nuclear compound required to run his reactor. Naturally, the only one around who still carries any tritium is Oscorp, and so Otto is made to seek out Harry Osborn. Now, in preparation for this entire analysis, I had also watched the first film, and there was something that caught my attention that had not beforehand. You see, the day after Green Goblin had killed all the Oscorp board members, Norman Osborn then pours himself a glass of whiskey. This is the mirror scene, by the way, where Norman discovers that he is in fact the Green Goblin, and the very one who murdered the board members. Depicted here is a bottle of Maker's Mark. Now note that Maker's Mark bottles are sealed with a red wax. It gives them a distinctive look. The bottle's very appearance coincides with the fact that Norman Osborn has discovered he has blood on his hands. This is the same whiskey that Harry himself drinks, and a bottle of Maker's Mark can also be seen on his desk at the penthouse, right before he makes a deal with Otto, a symbolic deal with the devil. Now, upon demanding that Harry hand over the tritium, Harry then offers him a deal to capture Spider-Man alive. Now, the only issue with the writing here is that Harry has no leverage other than that he knows where the tritium is, in which case Otto would probably have gotten what he wanted if he had continued to threaten Harry's life. Now, here's a better way to have constructed this scene. Have Harry put his house in a lockdown state with Otto attempting to pry his way inside. And with security on its way, Harry would have been granted more leverage in making this deal. There's another aspect here I want to draw your attention to. This. This entire scene is set at night and there's ongoing flashes of thunder and lightning occurring at dramatic intervals. Now, just keep this in mind. I'll have a lot more to say about this in the future, but it's very important. Anyway, in order to locate Spider-Man, Harry advises Otto to seek out Peter Parker. And then, almost as if to reassure the audience of their friendship, Harry insists that Otto not hurt Peter. Funny how he would say this, given how he up and slapped Peter in a drunken rage at the planetarium party.
Brother?
But this is yet another aspect about the movie that is not fully fleshed out. The friendship between Harry and Peter. Beyond being told that they are friends, much of what happens in the movie undermines that conception. There's even another conflict here with regard to Otto's relationship with Peter, one that had also not been fully fleshed out but greatly impacts Otto's resentment near the end of the movie. Specifically, when Otto hears Peter's name here, there should have been a moment where he stops and reconsiders his actions, before his arms reassert their dominance. So Peter reads a headline that shows crime has increased due to Spider-Man's absence. Following this, he is witness to a burning building with people still trapped inside. Although he is without his powers, he dares run inside and he winds up rescuing a child. And here, if I'm to continue on the trail of noting lapses in internal logic, then I suppose what I should say here is that there's no way Peter would ever have been able to breathe in that building without some kind of mask. That, and he most certainly would have been burned on multiple occasions given how close he was to all the fire. And on top of all this is the fact that he somehow knows who the parents are. He just zeroes in on them before handing the child to him. And they don't even thank him afterwards. Peter is given an oxygen mask, the presence of which contradicts the fact that he didn't have any problems breathing before, until he got outside, of course, and then cue this coughing fit. Well, nevertheless, the dialogue that follows indicates that while Peter was able to save this child, there was someone else in the building that never made it out. And here Peter suspects that if he had been Spider-Man, there was a chance he would have been able to save both lives. Next, we see Peter at his apartment looking outside, and here one wonders why wouldn't Otto have been there waiting for him? Or does he not know where Peter lives? Something else I should note here is that we're nearly an hour and 20 minutes into the movie at this point, and it's about here that we are due a transition into Act 3, so what's the holdup? Now one might assert that the third act came about already. It was marked by the deal made by Harry and Otto, right? Well, no, I would argue otherwise, that the second act has been defined by Peter's loss of powers and the negative outcomes of that choice. We're still on that trail. Act 3 will be defined by the reversal of all that, where Peter regains his powers and heads off for a final confrontation. Act 2 is being drawn out, but to a very purposeful extent, especially with regard to this scene, which holds a great deal of peripheral significance with this analysis. So Peter is at an impasse. He stands there at his window, alone, lonely, and without a shred of hope. The love of his life is due to be married, his best friend hates him, he's also alienated his only surviving family member, and crime in the city is on the rise. He's at a significantly low point here, left to conclude that he just can't ever have what he really wants. And then he receives a visitor.
Would you like a piece of chocolate cake?
Although we're never told her name in the movie, the script identifies this girl as Ursula Ditkovich, the landlord's daughter. And for anyone out of the loop, Ursula's last name is a reference to Steve Ditko, who was the co-writer for Spider-Man alongside Stan Lee. Now the movie hints that Ursula harbors a crush on Peter, and she shows herself to be just as, if not more awkward than he is, at social interactions. Of all the other people in the movie, Ursula is the only one who truly understands what Peter is going through, and it's possible she even knows that he's Spider-Man. Humbly but sincerely, she offers Peter a piece of cake, and it's important that her offering comes directly after Peter asks himself whether or not he's allowed to have what he wants, like this was set up in response. Ursula projects an immense innocence and purity here, which is a bright spot amidst this web of turmoil Peter finds himself in. Pun intended, by the way. And symbolically, the cake represents simplicity. Peter's life has become extremely complicated, so Ursula initiates a return to the reality of his situation. His conscience stung, there really is only one option for him to take at this point, and that option makes itself as readily clear as the delicious taste of a slice of cake. Now, with regard to this analysis, there's much I've said so far about lapses in internal logic, and trying to make sense of the movie from a more practical standpoint. Even so, you'll note I always retreat back to talking about how lapses in internal logic only complicate the otherwise basic nature of a melodrama. And writers are not necessarily required to imbue an overabundance of sophistication in their work, just because some critics may demand it. This scene here makes my point exactly. One should be keen in overestimating the amount of sophistication the average audience member brings to the theater. Like I said, this is the reason we have melodrama in the first place. Sophistication has largely been filtered out. What we're left with is the most basic of motivations and reactions from our characters. I began this analysis by saying Spider-Man 2 was a simple movie, and I meant that. For all intents and purposes, Spider-Man 2 is that slice of cake. And so I can wax on and on about why this or that doesn't make sense, or why this or that isn't practical, and why the writers should have tightened up here or there. In the end, however, when all is said and done, the cake was still delicious. That's the point. And for anyone who's made it this far into my analysis, you understand the meaning behind the title of this mega essay. Incidentally, this scene is my favorite scene in the movie. Besides Peter, Ursula is the most natural character in the entire movie. And it's a damn shame that Peter did not abandon his hopes and dreams with MJ and decide to take up with her instead. After Peter finishes his cake, Ursula takes his dishes, and she's about to leave when she suddenly remembers. She had a note from Aunt May that she was supposed to deliver to him. Upon visiting May, Peter sees that she's packing her things, given the foreclosure on her house. May then embraces Peter, and she thanks him for having confessed the truth to her. That, and telling him that she loves him, are enough to indicate that she has forgiven him. There's a young boy named Henry Jackson who's helping May pack her things, and he asks Peter where Spider-Man has gone. May chimes in as well, hinting that she is well aware of Peter's secret identity. In fact, her knowledge of who Spider-Man is holds true to the comic books. At some point she figured it out, but never said anything until much later. Her dialogue also continues to promote her belief in Spider-Man's importance, aimed at boosting Peter's morale. And while she knows Peter has diverged from that path, she nevertheless urges him to get back into the saddle.
I believe there's a hero in all of us that keeps us honest, gives us strength.
Remember, no matter where you go, there you are.
Peter thinks to himself, it do be like that sometimes. And so he takes to the roof of a building and makes a daring leap with the belief that his powers will just reactivate. Unfortunately, they do not, and he winds up taking a fall that should have either crippled him or killed him. I say should have, although there is a possibility that he has retained, or maybe regained, some of his earlier resiliency. Either way, he is able to walk away from the fall with naught but his back being bent out of shape. Now, as I've been saying all along, the writing here alludes to Spider-Man as being far more of an ephemeral endowment rather than a biological mutation. This power is a gift from God, exceeding and not beholden to Peter's desires. Therefore, Peter cannot easily reobtain his powers just because he wants to. They must first be re-bestowed. And if we're to look at Peter's powers allegorically, the tenets of those powers fall in line with an authoritative structure rather than a will to power. In other words, Peter must first assign himself to his former duties as commissioned by Uncle Ben before he can reaffirm the powers that he once had. There's some kind of federal vision involved, which is perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Spider-Man 2. In fact, I doubt many, if any, critics would ever approach the medium in this manner because talking about federalism in relation to the orchestration of powers is not widely discussed or understood in general. But in a nutshell, Peter's powers are derived from a higher authority. That's the takeaway here. And while I can clearly say this is God, the movie tiptoes around that matter while simultaneously attributing a general moral uprightness to Peter's motives, without alluding to where that would come from. Peter cannot embody Spider-Man unless he rediscovers how to love. And love, in this case, is his willingness to lay down his life for others. Now that goes a long way farther than physical death. It also entails Peter's willingness to give up his own desires for the sakes of others.
Courageous, self-sacrificing people, setting examples for all of us. Everybody loves a hero. Now, sometimes we have to be steady and give up the thing we want the most. Even our dreams.
Well, being brilliant's not enough, young man. You have to work hard. Intelligence is not a privilege, it's a gift. And you use it for the good of mankind.
Peter, all the times we've talked of honesty, fairness, justice, all of those times I counted on you to have the courage to take those dreams out into the world. You've been given a gift, Peter. With great power comes great responsibility. Take my hand, son.
Ultimately, what all this amounts to is painting Spider-Man as being a Christ-like figure, but with all his selfless behavior and sacrificial tendencies. However, Peter Parker is not Spider-Man because he has chosen to be Spider-Man, but rather because he was ordained to be Spider-Man by a higher power and a higher moral authority. Moving on from here, we get a rare scene away from what's happening with Peter, and we see MJ sorting through wedding invitations with John Jameson. Here, John suggests they invite Peter to the wedding. MJ dismisses the proposal before heading over to make out with her fiancé. She does so upside down as an obvious callback to the kiss she shared with Peter in the first film. She is conflicted, so she asks Peter later on to meet her at a cafe. Now, the entire melodramatic soap opera ordeal that I've been talking about lands heavily on this interaction, given the same moment MJ is having second thoughts coincides with Peter's want to become Spider-Man again. And so Peter is forced to turn her down yet again. This time MJ doesn't believe him when he says he doesn't love her. Part of what spurs MJ on in this instance is the nagging suspicion that Peter is indeed Spider-Man. And as a last-ditch effort to confirm that suspicion, she insists that Peter kiss her.
Hold up. Wait a minute. Something ain't right.
No. You're engaged. You see, this is yet another scene where the movie's writing makes it incredibly difficult to see MJ as being anything other than selfish and self-centered.
We never got on. You can't get off if you don't get on, Peter.
I don't think it's that simple.
Of course you don't, because you complicate things.
Well, regardless, calamity strikes right before MJ is sated. A car is thrown through the cafe window, nearly splattering the two of them. But thanks to Peter's spidey sense kicking in at the last minute, he shields MJ while diving away from the impact. Now, something remarkable to observe here is that this scene works in contrast with the reactor meltdown that killed Otto's wife. Remember, in that scene, glass shards were sent flying towards both of them, yet Otto's instinct was to protect himself and not Rose. This scene here at the cafe won't be the final instance of this contrast, by the way. And now let's take a trip through internal logic again, shall we? One questions where Otto was when he threw that car, and why would he have even done that in the first place? His intent was to draw Spider-Man out through Peter. But surely he realizes that the car could have very well have killed Peter, right? Now note that I am assuming there's a rational line of thinking to Otto's actions. But that thinking has clearly been influenced by the mechanical arms, right? So I suppose one could tread lightly with regard to assigning any rationality to what Otto does in this movie entirely, including, by the way, throwing Peter at the wall, in which case if Peter's powers had not been renewed, he would have been either maimed or killed. So, regardless of all that, Otto delivers an ultimatum to Peter here, demanding that Spider-Man be put back into action, or MJ will suffer. And so Otto leaves Peter under a pile of rubble, but soon after, Peter arises with his powers fully restored. Beyond some divine intervention, what's also implied here is that Peter's throwing himself between MJ and the car was a reaffirmation of his duty as Spider-Man. There's also something symbolic about Peter being buried and then rising from beneath the pile, his strength renewed. Death, and resurrection. And now we transition into Act 3, the final act of the film. And just as the Daily Bugle has served as the precursor to Acts 1 and 2, the same goes here. The fight aboard the New York City L train is the pre-climax, followed by one final fight with Doc Ock, and then we head into the denouement. Here we're about an hour and a half into the film with about 30 minutes to go. And like I said before, this is a bit behind the curve, if we're going strictly by 40-minute segments in a 2-hour movie. By my estimation, this means there was roughly 10 minutes of leeway in Act 2 that could have been adjusted to better fit a uniform 3-act paradigm. And I'll talk more about that as I continue. Now, given MJ's impending marriage to his son, J. Jonah Jameson is left despondent over her loss. But then at the cuff of his admitting that he was wrong about everything he ever said about Spider-Man, Peter sneakily retrieves his suit from JJ's office, enraging the editor-in-chief. More than any other scene in the film, this one engages the most in comic book type conventions. In the blink of an eye, Peter grabs his suit, which was previously pinned to the wall, and within a split second he somehow leaves a web with a note attached to it before he disappears. All of this works to the scene's advantage because the camera never catches any of it. We're simply made to react alongside the other parties present in the room. Now, this scene exemplifies one of the primary reasons why probing too far into the movie's internal logic is not at all complimentary to what this movie is. Everything is an illusion, and there is a lot that is to be left to your imagination. I mean, you can even look at the headline the Bugle produces afterwards. There's no picture. But the people of New York City are no doubt baited into buying this paper because of the headline. Page 2 promises them pictures, after all. And this is how one mythologizes one's characters. Spider-Man is made to look larger than life, accomplishing the most outlandish of feats. Coincidentally, we get a little bit more foreshadowing of the fight between Spider-Man and Doc Ock on the L train, noted by the story at the top right corner of the paper. And that's to happen very shortly here. Spotty and Ock have a fight atop West Side Tower, and we get a bit more of Otto's unexplained resiliency here. He's just taking the brunt of every punch Spider-Man delivers. There's that, and the pair of them eventually fall onto the L train, and Otto just gets up like he woke up on the wrong side of the bed. At this point in time, however, continually mentioning this has become wearisome. We'll just take it as granted that Otto is somewhat indestructible for no other reason than he needs to be in order to fight Spider-Man competently. The fight continues for some time, with Otto endangering the passengers aboard the train, but Spidey comes to their aid on every instance. At best, this is just a taunt from Otto. The only reason he starts throwing passengers is because he knows Spider-Man will stick his neck out to save them. That is Spider-Man's mandate, after all. This also falls in line with what I said earlier about JJ's constantly painting Spider-Man as a villain. And to be clear, many of the villains Spider-Man fights find it worthwhile to exploit Spider-Man's good nature. Being a hero is tough work. Now, what Otto resembles here is a child throwing a tantrum. Spider-Man is making a fool of him. This theme has been present throughout all of Spider-Man and might as well be the primary aspect that makes the character's appeal long-lasting. Comedy mocks the vanity of visions of rational control. The person who can joke amidst a confrontation with evil, like the quick-witted Spider-Man, must be reconciled to the permanent imperfections of a corrupted world populated by fallen creatures. This is a quote from one Peter Leithart, an American author, minister, and theologian. And it comes from a larger essay comparing Spider-Man with Batman. Now, whereas Batman always comes across as super serious, Spider-Man is always cracking jokes at the expense of those he fights. Now, Batman's antithesis happens to be the Joker, a man who cuts right through Batman's seriousness by turning everything into a gag. In Spider-Man's case, however, the opposite is true. Most of the villains he fights embody seriousness. And so Spider-Man is the Joker to their Batman. The lesson that Spider-Man is supposed to teach us is that for anyone who would impose their visions of rational control upon others by power of will, comedy proves to be their greatest enemy. Comedy reveals the imperfections of the vain and the haughty. You see, the prideful prefer not to have their sins laid bare, lest their inner machinations be exposed. That's what Leithart means when he talks about the permanent imperfections, a corrupted world, and fallen creatures. Many of these aspects are not readily apparent to us, for we are blinded by our own nature. The natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God because they are folly to him. He is not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. But that is why comedians are revered. Much of the reason we seek to laugh at the folly of those who would impose their will upon us is simply because we seek refuge from that tyranny that endears Spider-Man to us. Having his plans frustrated by Spider-Man, Otto resorts to throwing the L train into overdrive by disabling the controls. Now, to be frank, I have no idea how an L train operates, and so have no point of reference by which I can say that pulling the throttle from the main cabin would have worked this way. Nevertheless, it does. Otto throws another quip before departing, leaving Spider-Man to figure out how to hit the brakes and save all the people from the oncoming destruction. Having only been given mere moments before the train hurtles to its doom, Peter recklessly tries several maneuvers to stop it, until he finally settles on webbing himself to the surrounding buildings. The entire experience leaves Peter screaming in agony, but he endures. Incidentally, the glass windows of the cabin break into pieces behind him as the car's metallic hull bends inward. And this is yet another scene in contrast with the shattering glass in Otto's lab. Unlike Otto's lab, Peter is here to take the brunt of the damage. And his arms are splayed out as well, representative of Christ on the cross. Wholly appropriate because Peter is intent on giving his own life to save everyone on the train. Now, just in case anyone thinks I'm going overboard in talking about the nature of the symbolism here, Spider-Man 2 was not the only film released in 2004 that was engaging in it. Only about 5 months prior to the release of Spider-Man 2, Mel Gibson had released The Passion of the Christ. That's not even symbolism at that point, that's about as literal as it gets. And then, about 5 months after the release of Spider-Man 2, Pixar would be releasing The Incredibles, wherein the protagonist, Mr. Incredible, is imprisoned. Like so. So I'm not sure what it was about 2004 that led to these coincidences popping up in these movies, which were also some of the year's highest grossing. Another, by the way, is Shrek 2. Not that there was any specific Christ on the cross imagery, but the story of Shrek 2 features the protagonist, Shrek, abandoning his former identity as an ogre in an effort to appeal to the princess, Fiona, and her family. So, similar to how Peter is trying to abandon his identity as Spider-Man in Spider-Man 2. We have another death and resurrection motif, after Peter suddenly passes out from exhaustion. Before he falls, the passengers inside catch him and lift him up. Multiple hands are seen bearing him, and they surround the spider symbol on his chest.
There's something about the hand being laid on someone that communicates the favor, the grace of God. Think of the contrast to that. In the Old Testament, the priest laid hands on the sacrificial animal before it was sacrificed to transfer the guilt of the people to the animal.
His limp body is further conveyed into the safety of the passenger car. And this is all done in a reverential manner, as would indicate that all the passengers really want to do is to touch him, to know that this mythological hero is real. Peter soon awakens to find a bunch of people looking over him in awe. At that moment, he's aware he has lost his mask. As fortune would have it, however, a young boy happened to find it. After giving it to Peter, another child reassures him that they won't tell anyone about his secret. In retrospect, I would have preferred it if that line hadn't been said at all, as it begs the question about whether or not the other passengers would have said anything. And true enough, there's nothing holding any of the people here back from giving Peter's physical description to the police, the press, or anyone. To that end, why would the writers have deemed it necessary to have Peter remove his mask at this critical point? Now, what I've determined is that what we're seeing here is a merger between two halves, Peter and Spider-Man. This is a visual indicator of such. Peter isn't wearing the mask, but he's still wearing the rest of his suit and being heroic. The scene of him suffering as he attempts to stop the train would not have come across as meaningful or dramatic if we weren't allowed to see that happen with our own eyes. And the trade-off here is that we're then supposed to buy into this idea that nobody who saw Peter's face would say anything. For that matter, what if they did? My point is that Spider-Man is a legend, and so if any of these people were to give a physical description of Peter Parker to anyone else, it's not like they would otherwise be compelled to believe what they were told, right? The key here is in convincing, not simply revealing. And as far as this movie is concerned, anyone who knows Peter would assume that he was far too wimpy to ever be Spider-Man. And there have been multiple moments in the comic books where Peter's identity was revealed to his friends and acquaintances, and surprise, surprise, many of them did not believe it either. Now, what this all comes down to is the fact that what people want to believe will often override what is really there. There's one particular line here that reflects that mentality.
He's just a kid. No older than my son.
That's how this would work. There are any number of perceptions that the people of New York City have about who Spider-Man is, and much of those are featured throughout the movie.
Whoa! He stole that guy's pizza!
It's a web. Go, Spidey, go!
Cool Spidey outfit. Thanks.
Suffice it to say, there's no given identity that could be revealed that would be readily accepted by the people of New York City, no matter how plausible the eyewitnesses might be. Now, Spider-Man's moment of heroism is cut short when Doc Ock invades the passenger car. He demands that Spider-Man be handed over to him. This is a moment that also reflects a moment in the first film, where many of the local citizenry openly defy the villain.
Oh yeah, I got something for your ass! You mess with Spidey, you mess with New York! You mess with one of us, you mess with all of us!
In this instance, however, their gesture is futile if not noble. Otto easily pushes them aside. Made too weak to defend himself and unwilling to allow anyone else be hurt, Spider-Man allows himself to be taken captive here.
Hey, you. You're finally awake.
After knocking him out, Otto then delivers Spider-Man to Harry, who's still drinking whiskey in his penthouse under the canopy of night. At this point, I should draw attention to some dramatic touches that prevail in these kinds of scenes. Although there's never any rain, lightning flashes here and there like an homage to classic horror films.
I am Frau Blucher.
Things like this are to be kept in mind when considering Spider-Man 2 from a practical standpoint, and not from a dramatic one. The weather effects are purely for the sake of adding a thrill, much less logic, to the scene. Admittedly, part of what inspired me to make this entire analysis in the first place was due some critiques that broke the movie down according to its lacking in practicality. And so to be clear here, having random flashes of lightning occur at dramatic intervals is not practical, but occurs purely as a result of inducing a sensation into the scene. Need it be said, this is what a movie is. It is an experience, not simply a means of conveying information. And if one does desire pure information be delivered to you, just read a synopsis of the film online. But movie makers don't live to write synopses or to recount the literal events that occur within a given story. A story is supposed to appeal to our humanity, and that means the artistry must endow special attributes that appeal to our emotions.
All right, I'm not stupid. You're saying that humans need fantasies to make life bearable?
No. Humans need fantasy to be human. To be the place where the falling angel meets the rising ape.
One final thing to note here is that this scene is juxtaposed quite bizarrely with the entire opening of the film. Remember that Peter Parker was out making pizza deliveries for parties throughout the city, and here now Otto has made his own rooftop delivery, one of which Harry is eager to slice into. In other words, Peter went from pizza delivery to being delivered like a pizza. So Harry hands over the tritium, which is very conveniently stashed within a safe inside his penthouse. Now, to be clear, this stuff is akin to any number of nuclear materials, and Harry just keeps it inside his penthouse safe. Now, much of what Harry does here can only be explained away by asserting that he has become irrational, and credit to the movie, Harry is constantly drinking, so his judgment is most likely highly impaired. Even so, he knows full well that Otto could destroy the city with this stuff.
More tritium, are you crazy? You'll destroy the city!
And so in response to Otto's previously attacking the penthouse, one wonders, shouldn't Harry have posted security around the perimeter? Another reason this scene is poorly written is that with regard to my entire commentary justifying why Peter's identity would stay intact, the same logic is not applied here. Harry approaches Spider-Man with a letter opener intent on killing him, but decides to remove the mask beforehand. Upon seeing Peter, the immediate thought that should have occurred was, oh, I've been duped. Here's what I mean, if Otto had delivered anyone wearing a Spider-Man suit to Harry, are we led to believe that Harry would have instantly assumed that that person was Spider-Man?
Cool Spidey outfit. Thanks.
This is all part of why the original deal doesn't make sense unless Harry somehow knew Otto would not have lied to him. In which case I suppose he was fortunate that Otto was so honest a dealer? Now, since Harry knows Peter was the one in the Spider-Man suit, that complicates things even more. The most likely conclusion Harry would have come to here was that when he told Otto to track down Peter, Otto must have knocked out Peter, and then dressed him up like Spider-Man and then delivered him. In fact, Peter could have played things out that way. Granted, burying himself in another lie might have undermined his intent to go after MJ at that point. When Peter wakes up, he immediately rips off his bindings and demands to know where Otto has taken MJ. And so if there were any doubts in Harry's mind, Peter would have dispelled them then and there. Now, when confronted about his father's death, Peter answers with this.
There are bigger things happening here than me and you.
Why this? Why wouldn't he have said, I didn't kill your father, but that's not important right now because MJ is in trouble? Would that have taken too much time to say? Now, all the problems rife throughout this scene need not be expounded upon in much more detail here, as I do believe they do come to term in the next film. Not in a good way, by the way, but suffice it to say there's no clear resolution here, because the writers had intended to promote this conflict as leading into the next movie's conflict. And so Harry needs to be 100% at odds with Peter in the next movie. And so that means Peter's letting Harry off with,
there are bigger things happening here than me and you.
Is made specifically reticent. I suppose it is too much to ask that movies try harder to find a resolution instead of sequel baiting us all the time. I've gone over this in other videos, but what this does is turn your characters into consumer products and devalues their personal identities in these works. You see, there's not much that's real about Harry Osborn's pain of loss if, by the end of the day, it just serves as the engine to give Spider-Man another bad guy to fight for the next episode, or the next movie. This runs along the same lines I mentioned concerning Otto's loss of his wife. Simply put, the movie remains far too uplifting and never allows the audience a chance to dwell on these tragedies to any real extent outside using them as a means of popping out new bad guys for Spidey to fight. In essence, this devalues said tragedies, allowing them to be written off as excuses for why the villains will engage in whatever for the sake of the next spectacle. Now, I'm jumping the gun a bit here, as much of what I'm saying greatly concerns the conception surrounding Spider-Man 3. There's also an audience whose level of engagement doesn't rise past the mark of desiring spectacle, desiring to see the next villain from the comic books show up in a live-action rendition. In other words, we don't care about, say, Eddie Brock's internal struggle so much as we want to see Venom in the next movie. That is the problem here. Much less there's an audience who wants to see Otto mourn tears of loss for his wife, or wants to have Harry Osborn reminisce about all the good times he spent with his father. These characters are just made out to be consumer products made to ship a superhero action movie, and so the story must gloss over the finer details that turn them into villains in the first place. And so somehow Harry knows where Otto is and tells Spider-Man where to go. There's no accounting for where that information came from. Now, remember how I said that Act 2 was about 10 minutes longer than it should have been? Something I'd have proposed here is that Peter and Harry should have had a scene where they work together to figure out where Otto is. Perhaps Harry takes them back to the lab and they find out power is being routed to one central location, and that's where Otto is. And within this moment, the two could find some brief reconciliation. The only caveat there is that we don't sequel bait the next film, but that's fine, because there's nothing compelling the writers to do that anyway. In fact, most of the complications in Spider-Man 3 would also have been fixed as a result of this as well, including the fact that Harry will be given amnesia because they need to rewind his character previous to the point where Spider-Man revealed who he was. So the final battle takes place in a sunken building within the New York City harbor. That's where Otto has completed construction on this larger reactor. The results are still the same, however. Multiple metal objects are pulled into the miniature sun. Spider-Man's timely arrival ensures MJ is saved, although his sticking his neck out causes him to fall prey to Otto's grasp yet again. Funny to see here is that MJ attempts a sneak attack in the same manner his Aunt May had earlier on. But this time Otto knows better, and he circumvents it. And the retractable blade shows up here again, by the way, although here the implement serves as a plot device, since Spider-Man intercepts the stab by grabbing a mass of cables connected to the reactor. As a result, Otto is electrified, but will miraculously survive. Although the reactor is left without power, the miniature sun does not dissipate as it had before, leaving Spider-Man to consider new options. There he notices Otto laying in the water nearby, stunned and confused. What's implied here is that the recent shock quelled the influence of the mechanical arms, allowing the real Otto to resurface briefly. Whether or not Peter figured this out is left to interpretation, but he nevertheless appeals to Otto's good nature, and even removes his mask to show who he really is. The struggle between good and evil is illustrated visually here as Otto tries to assert control over the arms. Peter reminds him of his own words about intelligence. Words that I'd said are similar to Uncle Ben's tempering power with responsibility. Otto is hereby redeemed thanks to Peter and by extension Uncle Ben's lasting influence. And so rather than allow Peter to sacrifice himself to save the city, Otto takes on that burden himself.
I will not die a monster.
The most important takeaway here is that Spider-Man is not the one who defeats Dr. Octopus. It is Otto Octavius who defeats Dr. Octopus, overcoming the demonic influence at long last before destroying his own life's work, and then due to the extra weight of the mechanical arms, Otto is left to drown in the river below. Again, I'd like to point out that the movie does downplay the emotional impact Otto's redemption should have had, since we didn't get to know the man much before he changed into Dr. Octopus. Hell, even as Doc Ock, the impressions one receives about the character are incredibly generalized. Now, I suppose this aspect isn't so much a detriment to the movie, since the movie isn't really about Otto in the first place. The story was mostly concerned about Peter's internal struggle, which is only minorly reflected by Otto himself. But what I'm saying is that there's no particular gulf of values that the story implements between the two characters. It's there, but it's minor. But the story doesn't involve divisions boasting the gulf seen in X-Men's Xavier and Magneto, for instance, or The Dark Knight's Batman and Joker. For the most part, Doc Ock is just a thug that Spider-Man has to defeat amidst going through his own existential crisis. Now, the movie isn't necessarily any worse off because of this, by the way, but I point it out because in a moment like this, where Otto is making the greatest sacrifice, the emotional impact does not hit as hard as it should. Now, since Peter had taken off his mask, MJ is left to have a moment to take in the revelation. The moment is disrupted by the destruction of their environ, and Peter is made to stop a giant metal wall from crushing them, but even that is overcome. Shortly after Otto's death and the destruction of the nuclear reactor, Peter is able to share a moment with MJ, where the truth is finally out in the open. The imagery here is also remarkable. Spider-Man spins a great web, lays MJ within it, and then approaches her like a spider would a fly trapped in its confines. What this symbolizes, however, is nothing as dire as a predatory creature intent on killing its prey. Quite the opposite, in fact. What this represents is that the mild-mannered Peter Parker can now readily approach MJ with nothing held back. Often the word predator is used as a pejorative, but in this case it complements the evolution of Peter Parker's character. Peter comes clean to MJ, saying he couldn't be with her because Spider-Man will always have enemies. Here it's not clear if he's talking about criminals in general or supervillains. He established this mandate based on his run-in with the Green Goblin, but assuming there would be more villains down the road is reading pretty far into what his condition means. As if Peter is somehow aware of what his fate will be if he remains Spider-Man, like he has some kind of franchise awareness or something. Now here the story is taking on a more poetic and melodramatic license, and so therefore this line is not necessarily worth criticizing, even though its meaning is somewhat antiquated. Spider-Man is not literally a knight in shining armor, but that is what he is supposed to embody. And so his duty must come before his personal feelings. That is the takeaway here. Now MJ says nothing to him in response, which is another pleasant change from their previous interactions. One may even get the impression that she's having to eat a lot of words that she said in derision to Peter in the past, all the while not realizing what he was going through. Summarily, she allows herself to be deposited on the ground to be found by John Jameson, escorted by the NYPD. Spider-Man departs soon after. We then cut back to the penthouse where Harry has been left to brood, holding a still clean letter opener in his hands. In this moment, we get another bout of demonic influence. Somehow, Norman Osborn appears in Harry's mirror.
Dad? I thought you were...
No. I'm alive in you, Harry.
This line is made interesting by the unrealized prospect that Norman may have implanted something within Harry to influence him. Here I recall an instance in the TV series Farscape where the main character, John Crichton, was injected with a neural clone of one of the show's villains.
We've reached the end of the old, the beginning of the new.
I am in control of me!
No more John.
That may have been an interesting road for Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy to have traveled. Norman Osborn coming up with some wild contingency to survive within his son after he died, like an undead lich from any number of fantasy settings. Instead, Norman's appearance serves as a highly irregular method of showing us what is going on in Harry's mind. But then again, perhaps this isn't so irregular after all. We've already established the inherent spiritual angle to much of what has been going on with Peter and his powers and Otto with his tentacles, and so perhaps we can take it for granted that Harry is readily seeing and hearing the ghost of his father. Norman then yells at Harry to avenge him, calling him weak, and in a rage Harry breaks the mirror, only to discover the Green Goblin lair inside. This is our sequel bait, of course, but there's one other caveat to apply here. Harry now knows his father was the Green Goblin. Now, given everything that the Green Goblin did in the first movie, including threaten MJ and murder many of Oscorp's staff members, this is yet another moment where Harry should have reconsidered the circumstances surrounding his father's death. However, as I've been saying, the writers do not seem to be interested in humanizing the story's villains as much as the intent is to set them up as future obstacles for the main character to fight. And much of that will cause problems down the road in Spider-Man 3. The epilogue is not so amazing. John Jameson is left standing at the altar, and MJ doesn't even give him the respect of telling him to his face that she no longer wants to marry him. She just sends him a note. Now, this whole scene is played for laughs, given JJ's chief concern here is saving the caviar. But one cannot help but feel sorry for John given all this effort and the fact that MJ strung him along for this long only to abandon him at the last minute. Now, the construction of this scene is due more melodramatic tension, naturally. We're supposed to be wondering here if MJ will actually go through with it all, and when we see the woman approaching John with the note, we're then made to breathe a sigh of relief. Fate has had its last laugh, and comic book canonicity remains intact.
Hey, where are all my comic books?
Oh, those dreadful things. I gave those away.
All this at the cost of making MJ look extremely manipulative. With regard to all this, I'm reminded of another film involving a similar situation, Sleepless in Seattle, produced in 1993. For anyone out of the loop, actress Meg Ryan plays a woman who is engaged to someone, but she falls in love with someone else due to a variety of outlandish circumstances. I won't get into it. What's important is that near the end of the film, she needs to break off the engagement, and this is how it's played out.
I don't want to be someone that you're settling for. I don't want to be someone that anyone settles for. Marriage is hard enough without bringing such low expectations into it, isn't it?
Walter, I don't deserve you.
No, I wouldn't put it that way.
Note this scene is about a minute long. It would not be hard to do. And given the context of this particular movie, one can write up a whole list of reasons why Meg Ryan's character was manipulative and cruel and whatever. And perhaps all of those would be appropriate. However, what matters in this instance is that she at least had enough gumption to come clean about how she truly felt. And what this leaves one with is closure, knowing that Bill Pullman's character wasn't left dejected by the entire experience. The two characters come to a mutual understanding and they break off their engagement. And so, in comparison, this just makes MJ look aloof and cowardly. Nevertheless, MJ runs to Peter's apartment, still wearing her wedding dress, and there she explains that she'll run the risks of being involved with him. And note how selfish her appeal is, including the fact that she says,
I know you think we can't be together, but can't you respect me enough to let me make my own decision?
please, that's just pure manipulation. Plus the fact that she was even with John Jameson was the result of her own decision too, right? And Peter respected that. So no, it's not a matter of respecting her enough to make her own decision, it's a matter of trusting her to make the right decision, of which this is not, for reasons Peter already laid out after rescuing her from Doc Ock's lair.
Isn't it about time somebody saved your life?
Wait a minute, what is she saying now? But she's never been there when he needed her. Not until she realized he was Spider-Man, in which case her entire investment is still predicated on what she wants. On the other hand, Ursula Ditkovich came to Peter at a point where he was in need and she offered him a piece of cake. In a sense, it was Ursula who saved Peter's life, not MJ. MJ was just content to while away the hours with some guy she had settled for, all the while holding out for her fantasy hero to come sweep her off her feet. What this means is that John Jameson was just an insurance package in case Spider-Man never showed up. Moreover, none of what she tells Peter here overrides anything Peter told her. Whether or not she would be willing to take the risks has nothing to do with the fact that Peter just doesn't want her to be a liability. Period. I mean, this is the entire reason why Peter lives all by himself, alone in his shoddy apartment. He doesn't want to involve Aunt May, Harry, or anyone else in his affairs because they could also become liabilities. Ultimately, this epilogue is terrible. It devalues the entire point of this story in the first place, which was about giving up what you want in order to do the right thing.
Sometimes we have to be steady and give up the thing we want the most. Even our dreams.
MJ is doing the exact opposite here, and the movie is trying to justify that? See, the way I would have ended things here would be to have Peter come to some reconciliation with Harry, since Harry knows his identity now. He left Harry after telling him there were bigger things at stake at the time. And now that Otto had been dealt with, shouldn't he have returned to him, telling him about what really happened? Granted, that hurts the setup for the next movie, but I've already addressed that. They're hurting their characters for the sake of establishing a cliffhanger for future spectacle. Beyond that, at the very end, MJ would have gotten married to John. Meanwhile, Peter just sits atop some high-rise building in his Spidey suit, polishing off another piece of chocolate cake before he eventually swings off to chase more sirens. It'd be a bittersweet ending, but that's life.
This is my gift. My curse.
So Spider-Man 2 is a simple movie. Very easy to follow from beginning to end. Did I prove that, or did my entire essay prove the exact opposite?
Serious?
Suppose I should have clarified from the very beginning that Spider-Man 2 was simple, but simple to me. Like I said, I consider myself to be a sophisticated individual, and so when I watch movies like this, I'm not left scratching my head wondering what's going on here or there. No, most of what's clear is clear because the story has everything written on its shoulder. This isn't bad, it's just not sophisticated. Spider-Man 2 isn't a movie I'd necessarily return to find out if I'd missed anything along the way. Not many movies are like that, to be honest, especially modern movies that are 100% preach, preach, preach. Instead, I prize works of art that allow audiences, viewers, partakers, etc. to think for themselves, and don't proceed to go with messages that assume the writers, producers, directors, or whoever it is seemingly know more about the world than anyone else does. Now, Spider-Man 2 is not as preachy as all that, although the message does tiptoe around truth, capital T by the way, but at the same time does not thrust much, if any, postmodern ideology into its narrative. There are also a lot of choices made in the writing that go against conventions, such as the fact that the main character loses his powers for a good third of the movie. And then there's the fact that Spider-Man never actually wins against Dr. Octopus. That's exceptional. The final battle does not culminate in a contest of strength or wits. Rather, Peter simply reminds Otto of who he is, or rather, of who he ought to be. Therefore, Otto is the one who overcomes the adversary, who resists the temptations of demonic influences and gives his own life to save everyone else. That was the chief message conveyed by Spider-Man 2, and it's not a popular one. Denial of oneself is an incredibly difficult endeavor, and so makes one all the more heroic, if one can accomplish that. As a side note, last year the movie Spider-Man No Way Home was produced, and there the MCU wants to start in making stories based on the existence of alternate realities. Unfortunately, what this does is present the current reality as fickle, open to changing simply because particular actors will it to change. No Way Home has Spider-Man trying to remake reality for the sake of personal preference. He is unwilling to live within the confines of his current reality. And the idea behind this is that reality is shaped by a will to power. In other words, the world around us is just of our making, not of any higher power. But for reasons I've already given, that isn't the message we get from Spider-Man 2. To clarify, in Spider-Man 2, the identity of Spider-Man is depicted as being an immutable essence worn by Peter Parker, and as such is not subject to the whims of Peter Parker. Remember that Peter does not regain his powers simply because he wants to. It's not by will to power, rather he gets them back in the act of fulfilling the moral mandate laid out by Uncle Ben. And that's what makes Doc Ock antithetical to Spider-Man here. He doesn't obtain his powers, the mechanical arms, in response to a moral mandate. Rather, the arms are a symbol of a Faustian bargain he made, his mind open to demonic influence. And so while Peter can try to reshape what he himself is, he cannot remake what Spider-Man is. Spider-Man is not subject to his human will to power. Therefore, if Peter chooses to be something other than Spider-Man, his powers will fade away. And fundamentally, this would imply that Spider-Man is of a greater substance than Peter is himself. And that would be key in understanding Spider-Man 2 as having an inherent Christian narrative. And so if you found you enjoyed this channel's content, give the video a like and subscribe to Rusty Cheese Knife. In addition, you may also support me through Patreon or Cash App, and the links for both may be found in this video's description. Thank you all for watching, and stay tuned for more.